Amid the harshest winter the frontier had ever seen, one settler's ingenuity transformed a cold, damp cabin into a refuge of warmth and safety. When the deep freeze came, his unyielding determination to protect his home from the biting cold led to the creation of a revolutionary hearth that would change the lives of countless others. Before we dive deeper into the story, let us know where you're watching from. And if survival tales like this inspire you, be sure to subscribe because tomorrow's episode will show you how innovation in the wilderness has always been driven by necessity. The winter winds howled across the plains, piercing through the cracks of the cabin walls and filling the air with the scent of frost and wood smoke. Inside, the fire crackled in the hearth. But it wasn't enough to stave off the growing chill that seemed to seep into every corner. The walls, thin and imperfect, could only hold so much heat. Every night felt like a battle, one that the settler knew he was losing. He had built his cabin himself, a labor of love and necessity. But even with all his efforts, the fierce northern winds found their way inside. The fire was meant to provide warmth, but it often felt as though the hearth itself was more of a trap than a safeguard. The room would warm for a few fleeting hours, but the cold always came back with a vengeance. Even the thick blankets he kept by his bed offered little comfort against the bone-chilling temperatures. It was during one of these bitter nights, when he sat hunched close to the fire, that the idea came to him. As he watched the orange glow of the embers dance, he began thinking of how the heat in his hearth seemed to quickly disappear, leaving the cabin cold once more. The solution lay not just in the fire itself, but in how the heat was distributed. What if he could build something that would not just trap the warmth, but slowly release it, keeping the cabin comfortable even when the fire died down? Over the next several days, he took to studying his cabin's structure. He knew his cabin well, every log, every crack, and yet he had never considered how much heat slipped away through the stone chimney or escaped out of gaps in the walls. The solution, he realized, lay beneath the hearth. The settler had always been a problem solver, one who couldn't simply accept things as they were. Over the course of his many years in the wilderness, he had learned that survival wasn't about brute force or having the sharpest blade. It was about understanding the land, the materials, and the tools at his disposal, and then applying that knowledge in unexpected ways. The trench hearth idea had come to him out of necessity. His cabin was too small, the wood too scarce, and the winter too harsh to simply rely on firewood alone. He would need something that could store the heat longer. The deep freeze outside wouldn't wait for his plans to take shape. He had no time to waste. The settler worked late into the evening, using tools he had crafted himself over years of necessity and trial. His hands were rough and calloused, the result of a lifetime spent in the wilderness, but they moved with a precision that had come from years of practice. He dug carefully beneath the hearth, making sure to stay level and steady. He knew that any misstep could spell disaster for the cabin's structural integrity. The trench would need to be both deep enough to store the heat and wide enough to ensure that the heat could circulate through the room. He didn't fully know if his idea would work, but he had no other choice but to try. The deep freeze had already taken so much from him, his crops, his livestock, and the warmth of his home. The risk of failure was a constant companion, but survival demanded he act. With each shovel full of earth, he built the trench deeper, the sweat on his brow freezing as it dripped from his face. His breath came in visible clouds, but the fire burned steadily behind him. He had no intention of abandoning the warmth. Instead, he worked to ensure that the warmth would outlast the fire. The trench would not be just a hole, it would be a mechanism to store heat, allowing the fire's warmth to radiate long after the flames had died. As the trench grew deeper, he lined it with smooth stones, carefully placing them to create a structure that could absorb and distribute heat evenly. Once he was satisfied with the base, he began to build up the sides, ensuring that no gaps would allow the heat to escape. Finally, he gathered the necessary materials, bricks, clay, and iron to complete his design. The construction took several days, each moment filled with uncertainty and exhaustion. On the night he finished, he stepped back, his eyes tired but determined. The trench hearth was completed. It was not as simple as the traditional hearth, but it was his creation, something born from the harshness of winter and the desperation to survive. He lit the fire with a careful hand, watching as the flames leapt and crackled. The heat began to rise, and soon it flowed into the trench, warming the stones he had placed. Slowly, the warmth spread throughout the cabin, radiating in all directions. For the first time in weeks, the chill of winter did not press against the walls, and the fire did not have to work tirelessly to keep the cabin warm. The settler sat back in his chair, watching the fire burn steadily in the hearth. He had created something that not only fought against the elements but worked with them. The cabin, once cold and unforgiving, was now a place of comfort, even in the deep freeze. He knew that what he had just accomplished would change the way he lived, but he also understood that it could change the lives of others who struggled against the same bitter winter. The trench hearth was more than just an invention, it was a testament to the human spirit's ability to adapt and endure, no matter the cost. And as the fire flickered in the hearth, the settler knew he had taken the first step toward a warmer, safer future in the wilderness. In the weeks following the completion of his trench hearth, the settler began to notice subtle changes. The nights had become less biting, and the days spent inside the cabin felt warmer, more comfortable. It wasn't just the hearth that had transformed the space, but the way the heat moved through the room, steady and unyielding, like a constant companion against the oppressive winter cold. The fire no longer needed to burn constantly to provide warmth, and for the first time he felt a sense of calm in his home. However, it wasn't long before the other settlers, men who had come to rely on their own means of survival, began to notice something different about the cabin. Smoke from the hearth was steady, not billowing out of the chimney like most others. The warmth radiated from the logs and stones of the cabin, and from the outside. It seemed like the settler had built something more than just a shelter, he had built a refuge from the unforgiving cold. It didn't take long for the word to spread. A neighboring trapper, drawn by the warmth of the hearth that seemed to spill out into the crisp evening air, made his way to the cabin. He knocked on the door, his face ruddy from the cold. The settler welcomed him in, offering him a seat by the fire. As they spoke, the trapper noticed the difference in the cabin's warmth. It was unlike anything he had ever experienced. He asked how the settler had managed it, and the settler, ever pragmatic, explained his innovation, the trench hearth that stored and radiated heat. "Never thought I'd see the day," the trapper said, shaking his head. "You've made this place a fortress, not just from the storms, but from the cold itself." The settler smiled faintly, his eyes twinkling with a mix of pride and humility. He wasn't one for attention, but he knew that his invention had meaning beyond just keeping his own cabin warm. It was a solution born from hardship, and now it was something that could change the way people survived in this frozen land. The trapper left, but not without promise. He would spread the word about what the settler had built, about the warmth that seemed to come from the hearth itself, even in the harshest cold. Over the next few weeks, more and more men came by, each seeking advice or simply to witness the marvel for themselves. The settler shared his methods freely, never expecting recognition or credit. To him, the warmth was enough. But to others, his creation was nothing short of revolutionary. By the end of the season, the trench hearth had become a whispered legend among the settlers. It was a symbol of resilience, proof that even the harshest winters could be conquered with enough ingenuity and determination. The settlers had always relied on their knowledge of the land and their skills to survive, but now they had a new tool to help them endure. The settler continued to refine his design, making adjustments where necessary. He knew that it wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about showing that, no matter how brutal the land, there was always a way to thrive. Winter was at its peak when the first true test of the settler's trench hearth came. The storms had grown fiercer, and the cold more biting. The snow fell relentlessly, covering the landscape in a thick white blanket that seemed to trap everything beneath its weight. The settler's cabin stood firm against the elements, but he knew this was no ordinary storm. This was a beast unlike any he had faced before. It began in the early hours of the morning, when the wind first howled through the trees, bringing with it the promise of something more devastating than the usual snowfall. The settler woke to the sound of his roof creaking under the pressure of the snow, and the howl of the wind was deafening. The temperature had dropped drastically, and even with the trench hearth working as it had before, the cold had a way of creeping into every corner, no matter how fortified the cabin seemed. He stoked the fire, adjusting the logs in the hearth, knowing that this storm would test the limits of his invention. The hearth had always worked well in steady cold, but nothing had prepared him for the unrelenting force of the blizzard that raged outside. As the snow piled up, he noticed the chimney beginning to clog, the wind and ice forcing it to become obstructed. The heat, now struggling to escape, built up within the cabin, creating an uncomfortable, stifling warmth that threatened to suffocate the space. It was in these moments, when the cabin's foundation seemed to groan under the weight of the storm, that the settler truly understood the resilience of his creation. The trench hearth was more than a solution to cold. It was an adaptive system that responded to the needs of the room. The stones in the trench absorbed the heat, and the clay and iron design he had worked so carefully to perfect began to work in harmony with the natural forces around it. But as the storm raged on, the settler knew it wouldn't be enough to simply trust the hearth alone. This was a test of endurance not just for the cabin, but for his own resolve. The cold seeped into his bones despite the warmth of the fire, and he was forced to bundle up in layers, his breath visible in the thick, still air. He kept the fire going, adding logs to the hearth when needed, but there was no denying that this storm was unlike any other. As the hours passed, the settler found himself growing restless. The fire flickered weakly, but the warmth in the room began to ebb. It was then that he realized his mistake. He hadn't calculated the full demands the storm would place on the hearth. The heat was no longer radiating as evenly as it once had, and the storm was sapping the energy from the room faster than the fire could keep up. In that moment, the settler made an important decision. He had built the hearth, yes, but it was not perfect. There were adjustments to be made. He needed more materials, stronger iron, better insulation, and perhaps more advanced methods of regulating airflow. But even in that realization, he was calm. He was not defeated by the storm, not even close. The settler knew that survival was a constant process of adaptation and learning, and though his hearth had failed him in this storm, it had brought him through many others. And so, with the storm still raging outside, the settler sat back in his chair, eyes on the flickering fire, and began to plan. His trench hearth was good, but he would make it better just as he had done with everything else in his life. Survival was not about perfection, it was about resilience, about adapting and adjusting until the land itself could not break you. The storm might have raged on, but the settler knew that, eventually, it would pass. And when it did, he would have learned from it, as he always did. The storm finally passed, but the settler knew it was only a brief reprieve. The deep freeze had come early that year, and the relentless winds, ice, and snow were far from over. Though the storm's fury had subsided, it had left behind a thick layer of snow, sealing the land in an icy grip that seemed to stretch for miles. The settler found himself staring out of the cabin window, watching the white wilderness beyond. The snow was beautiful in its stillness, but it also carried with it a sense of isolation, an ever-present reminder of the harsh reality he lived in. The hearth had proven its worth during the storm, but it had also shown its limitations. The heat that had radiated so steadily during milder weather had struggled to keep up with the overwhelming cold and snow. The settler's cabin had remained warmer than most, but the storm had exposed a weakness that could not be ignored: the lack of insulation beyond the hearth. The walls, the roof, even the floors, all of them had gaps, cracks, and flaws that allowed the cold to seep in, no matter how well the fire burned. He knew that to survive the coming weeks, he would need more than just his trench hearth. It wasn't enough to simply fight the cold. He had to fortify his home, ensure that every part of the cabin could withstand the harshness of the wilderness. The settler had always prided himself on his resourcefulness, but the storm had taught him that survival meant anticipating the unexpected and preparing for it. It was time to make some hard decisions. He began with the roof. Though the stone fireplace and trench hearth had kept the inside warm, the roof was still vulnerable. Snow had accumulated in thick layers, pressing down on the structure, and even though the logs were solid, the weight of the snow could cause serious damage. The settler climbed up to the roof, using his hands to clear the roof. Snow, but he knew it wasn't enough. He had to reinforce it further, add layers, to prevent any weak points from giving way. It would take time, but it was essential. Over the next few days, he gathered materials: wood, stone, and even some of the iron nails he had kept from his initial cabin build. He worked tirelessly, day and night, fixing the roof and reinforcing the walls. Every moment of labor was done with precision and care. The settler knew that there was no room for shortcuts in the wilderness. Any weakness in the cabin, no matter how small, could become a deadly vulnerability. As the days passed, the settler began to feel the weight of the isolation. The cold was biting, and though he had his hearth, the wind outside was relentless. He thought back to the time before he had built his cabin, to the days when he had wandered the wilderness, searching for something to call his own. The hearth, the walls, the roof, these were the things that had kept him alive, but, more than that, they were his proof that he had endured. The struggle was far from over, but he would never stop building, never stop improving, for as long as the wilderness would test him. By mid-January, the settler had made significant progress. His cabin was stronger now, reinforced with the layers of wood and stone he had carefully added. The trench hearth, too, had been adjusted, its heat more evenly distributed, and its capacity to store warmth had improved. But even with these improvements, he knew that the real danger had only just begun. Winter in the mountains was unforgiving, and it wasn't just the cold that threatened him. In the distance, he had begun to notice signs of something else, something that made the back of his neck prickle with unease. The tracks in the snow were fresh, and they were larger than anything he had ever seen before. A mountain lion, perhaps, or something more dangerous? It was hard to tell from the tracks alone, but the settler knew he couldn't ignore them. The wilderness was full of predators, and his cabin was no exception to their attention. One evening, as he sat near the fire, the sound of a twig snapping outside caught his attention. His instincts flared, and he quickly extinguished the fire, pulling the heavy woolen curtains shut over the window. He sat in the darkness, listening, waiting. The wind had died down, leaving a rare silence in its wake. Then, just as he had feared, a low growl echoed from outside. The settler's heart pounded in his chest. A bear? No, the sound was too high-pitched. It was a mountain lion. The thought sent a shiver through him. A mountain lion was a stealthy predator, one that could silently stalk its prey and strike without warning. It was smart, methodical, and relentless. The growl came again, closer this time. The settler moved quietly across the room, reaching for his rifle. He wasn't foolish enough to think that a rifle alone would keep him safe from a mountain lion. The beast had learned to evade traps and avoid direct confrontation with humans. But the rifle was his only chance, a way to defend himself, to hold off the creature long enough to reach his tools or even the trench hearth if he needed to. He made his way to the door, his breath slow and deliberate. His cabin was solid, but a determined predator would find a way in if given enough time. The settler thought back to the bear that had circled his cabin months ago. That bear had tested the strength of his walls, his hearth, his defenses. But the lion was different. More agile, more precise. It wasn't just the cold he had to worry about anymore. The growl came again, now directly outside his door. The settler didn't move. He was waiting for it to make its next move. He had spent his life learning the wilderness, and he wasn't about to let it defeat him now. He wasn't just protecting a cabin, he was protecting his life, and he had never been one to give up without a fight. The mountain lion's growl echoed louder this time. Its low rumbling vibrated through the cabin walls. The settler's pulse quickened, but he remained still, his breath barely audible as he gripped his rifle with steady hands. The night outside was dark, cold, and unforgiving, but inside, the warmth from the hearth provided a fragile sense of safety. He knew better than to trust that warmth completely, not with a predator so near. The cabin, though sturdy, was still vulnerable. The large wooden door and the narrow window were the only true weaknesses. The settler had reinforced everything else, the roof, the hearth, even the walls. But this was different. This was not the brutal cold of winter or the battering winds that could be endured with fortitude. This was a living, breathing threat, one that had its own instincts, its own hunger. His mind raced through the possibilities. If the lion decided to try its luck, he would need to act fast. There was no room for hesitation. If it broke through the door, he might have only seconds before it was inside. His best chance was to confront it from the window, from the safety of the high vantage point that gave him both visibility and protection. The settler moved silently to the side of the cabin, positioning himself to get a view of the porch where the lion had been prowling. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, soft flakes drifting down as if nature itself were holding its breath. The storm, which had been quiet for hours, was returning a fitting cover for the lion's movements. Through the fogged-up glass of the window, the settler could make out a shadow moving along the edge of the cabin, its body sleek and low to the ground. The mountain lion was cautious, watching, waiting. It was smart, patient, more than just a predator, it was a tactician. He could see the lion's amber eyes glint in the moonlight, scanning the cabin with a slow, deliberate rhythm. The settler's heart hammered in his chest, but he kept his movements minimal, avoiding any sudden shifts that might alert the creature. The rifle was cocked, ready, but he knew that one shot might not be enough. Mountain lions didn't fall easily, and they were just as likely to retreat as they were to strike. For several long minutes, the lion circled the cabin, its growls quieter now, almost contemplative. The settler's grip on the rifle tightened. He wasn't waiting for the creature to make its move. He was waiting for it to make the wrong move. If it attempted to climb the wall, he would be ready. If it tried the door, the trap would spring. But the mountain lion didn't rush. Instead, it moved along the walls, circling, testing, probing for weaknesses. The settler's heart pounded in his ears as time seemed to stretch. In these moments, he could hear only the occasional shift of the lion's paws in the snow and his own breath, controlled and even. Then, just as the lion seemed to lose interest, it paused. Its nose twitched. Sensing something more than the scent of the cabin's warmth, it had detected something. The settler, holding his breath, prepared for the next move, knowing full well that patience was as much a weapon as the rifle in his hands. Time stood still as the mountain lion paused, its body coiled and its eyes locked on the cabin's door. The settler's muscles tensed, his hands steady on the rifle. Every second felt like an eternity as he waited for the lion to decide whether it would attack or retreat. The wind picked up again, howling through the trees, but within the cabin, the silence was all-consuming. Then, in an instant, the mountain lion sprang forward with terrifying speed. Its powerful hind legs propelled it toward the door, claws extended, its growl loud and predatory. The settler's instincts kicked in, and without thinking, he threw the curtain aside and raised his rifle. The lion's body was a blur of motion as it came within, inches of the door, its jaws bared and its claws striking at the wood. The settler's fingers squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, deafening in the small space. For a heartbeat, the world stood still, and then the lion's body lurched in midair, its forward momentum halted by the bullet. It let out a choked scream, a high-pitched noise of pure frustration and pain, before collapsing onto the snow in front of the cabin, its legs twitching for a moment before going still. The settler lowered his rifle, his chest heaving with ragged breaths. The adrenaline surged through him, his body still tense, but the immediate danger had passed. He quickly moved to the door, checking the lion's lifeless form through the window. The creature had fallen just short of the door, its body frozen in place by the fatal shot. He allowed himself a moment to process what had just happened, his mind whirling. It wasn't the first time he'd faced danger in the wilderness, but it had been the most personal. This time, the predator hadn't just been hunting for food, it had been hunting him. And in that moment, he realized that the wilderness was not simply a place to survive. It was a place where everything was a challenge, where every victory was hard-won, and where a single mistake could be fatal. He stood there for a moment longer, watching the snow continue to fall over the mountain lion's body, the eerie quiet of the world outside settling in once more. The settler had won this battle, but the wilderness had a way of reminding him that it would always test him, always demand more. As he closed the door and returned to his hearth, the warmth inside no longer felt like a mere shelter. It felt like the result of survival of ingenuity, strength, and the unwavering will to face whatever the wilderness threw his way. The night was far from over, but for now, the settler had won. The mountain lion was no longer a threat, and his cabin stood as a testament to the fact that, despite the odds, he had survived another test. As the days passed, the settler's victory over the mountain lion faded into the background of his daily routine. The cabin, fortified by his persistent efforts, stood resilient against the harsh winter, but the battle for survival never truly ended. Every decision, every action had its price. The settler knew this better than most. His winter had become a series of careful calculations, the balance between maintaining the hearth, fixing the roof, and ensuring the walls held strong against the relentless cold. His hands had grown calloused once more, and his body ached from the labor that was required to make his home both a fortress and a sanctuary. The world outside was still bitter and unforgiving. He could feel the weight of each passing day in his bones, the cold, the isolation, the constant threat of predators, human and animal alike. There was no room for complacency in the wilderness. Every moment was a reminder that survival was not guaranteed, but amid the strain, the settler had found a certain peace. The hearth was still the heart of the cabin, its warmth offering solace against the freeze. The cabin itself, though humble, had become something more than just wood and stone. It was his refuge, his proof of resilience, and the place where his spirit remained unbroken. Still, he wondered, would his efforts be enough when the next trial came? Would his fortress withstand the test of time, or would nature, as it always did, find a way to wear it down? As the days grew shorter and the nights colder, the settler knew he couldn't afford to stop. Survival required constant vigilance, and the wilderness was a place where yesterday's victory could quickly become tomorrow's danger. By the time spring arrived, the snow had melted, revealing the rugged, worn landscape beneath. The settler stood at the edge of his cabin, the morning light warming his weathered face. The cold of winter had finally loosened its grip, and the quiet of the land seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The mountain lion's body had long since been carried away by the scavengers, but the memory of that night lingered, a quiet testament to the fragility of life in the wilderness. The settler had learned much during that harsh winter, lessons about the land, about building, and about himself. His trench hearth, once just an idea born of necessity, had proven its worth, enduring through the bitter cold and the challenges the wild had thrown at him. It had provided warmth, safety, and a kind of certainty in a world where nothing was guaranteed. As he surveyed the cabin, the settler couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He had done what he had set out to do. He had built a home, not just for survival, but for living. The land would continue to test him, but he was ready. His hearth, his walls, and the very earth beneath his feet were proof of his resolve. They stood firm, and in that moment, the settler knew that he had left something behind, something enduring, something that would outlast him. The wilderness, with all its challenges and dangers, had been both his teacher and his adversary. But through it all, he had remained unbroken. And in the heart of the mountains, the legacy of his struggle would live on, a quiet reminder of the power of human ingenuity and the will to survive.